Good evening. Welcome back to COVID-19 and the Future of New York, sponsored by Thinkers Anonymous. We are now in our 7th week of this conference, and our 8th and final session is next week. We do hope you can make it. But you are here right now, and we have a lot to get to this evening. I'm your host, Kirk Tatnall, and we continue to journey through a survey of our great city, New York, searching for life and revival in the vital areas that make this such a special place. COVID-19 has done 3 things. It has stolen many of our residents and many of the things dear to them, but it has also stolen our confidence. Areas that were somehow so assured in their turbulent rhythm, business, tourism, retail, now have very uncertain futures. And our city is interwoven. The effects of one area affect the others. This symposium cannot offer a 2020 vision of New York's future, but it can do the next best thing, provide the experts who have the clearest knowledge and vision for where it's going. They are all realistic optimists, and their responses provide us enough of what lies ahead to know it will be worth the ride to get there. A quick note of thanks to Sabrina Fong, Deputy Director of Research at the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, who spoke eloquently, passionately last week about the governmental and community efforts to support our newest arrivals in this time of crisis. The personal story of her mom's journey from China and the hardships and triumphs she faced show once again the critical importance of our city and the promise it provides of a new life for so many of us. So why do we love New York City so much? Well, for one reason, it's a reality play. Its streets are a stage. Its cast filled with characters that are located only here. It is towering sets and dramas and musicals that play out daily across the full gamut of humanity. Now put that energy and changing storylines and supreme talent into a confined space for a rapt audience, and you have the New York theater. Most of us had a moment at a show that was transcendent, and that is the power of the concentrated force of live entertainment that can only be found in one American city. But of all the areas we discussed these last 2 months, only one shut down entirely: the theater. And this loss has been monumental. During the 2018-2019 season, Broadway contributed $14.7 billion to New York's economy and supported 96,900 jobs. Almost 250,000 people were seeing a Broadway show every week, selling more tickets than all of the metropolitan area's professional sports teams combined. Of all the things that are most particularly enchanting about New York, it is the loss of live performance over the last year that has stolen the bulk of its character. And now it returns. Governor Cuomo announced that most capacity restrictions will end beginning May 19th. That is tomorrow, as COVID vaccination rates continue to rise. Theaters can technically reopen on that date, although the fall is when many will. But who will come? Will an industry so dependent on tourists, business travelers, and the elderly be the attraction it once was? Again, we have people to provide the answers and the questions. First, let me introduce again my beautiful wife, Risa Shoup, who is now in her 3rd tour of duty fielding your questions. Please submit them at any time at your leisure, starting now, and we will get to as many as possible within the hour. And our very special guest this evening is the Executive Director for the Alliance of Resident Theaters New York, an organization that assists over 400 member theaters in managing their companies in ways that allow them to realize their rich artistic visions and well serve their diverse audiences through funding, training, physical space, and network connections. She has over a decade in senior leadership roles with New York City cultural and community development nonprofits, and a strong track record working with cross-sector partners and sponsors to inform strategic policy for the equitable growth of accessible and inclusive cultural spaces and services in New York City. Prior to this, she served as a senior consultant at CARP Strategies, and was the executive director of Spaceworks, a nonprofit dedicated to developing subsidized workspace for artists and cultural workers across New York City's 5 boroughs. She chairs the board of the Invisible Dog Art Center, is the treasurer of the board for Naturally Occurring Cultural Districts New York, and is a trustee and co-chair of the planning committee of the American LGBTQ+ Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, Risa Shoup.
Thank you, Kirk. I'm really happy to be here this evening. Thank you also, Rini, for helping out with questions. And thank you to everybody who's in the invisible virtual audience. I'm really eager to hear what your questions are and hear your responses to what I have to say. You know, I've been thinking about this presentation a lot, as you can imagine, and I was just saying to Kirk before we began that as much as I can tell you about my organization and the current state of Off-Broadway and what we're thinking about for the future, so much remains uncertain. And one thing I do know is that theater is people. You know, it's the people who are performing on stage, it's the people who write it, it's the people who greet you at the door, it's the people who sell you concessions, it's the people who build and design the sets. Theater is, at its stripped to its bare minimum, theater is just people. And we've had to pivot in a shocking way. And we've lost a certain human connection, but fortunately we haven't lost the ability or the drive to make theater. And it's for that reason that I'm tremendously optimistic about the future. But again, I have a lot of questions myself, and I hope we can sort of dig into some of those together. Before we begin talking, I think about, you know, more broadly the state and the future of off-Broadway theater in New York, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my organization, the Alliance of Resident Theaters New York. I wouldn't be a good executive director if I didn't take a few minutes for a little advertisement about us. But more than that, you know, I don't know what any of you folks do professionally or what your hobbies are, but I can imagine, as I've run arts services organizations for most of my career, that you probably don't engage with an artist services organization very often. So again, I'd like to tell you a little bit about us. We were founded in 1972, so we'll be 50 next year. And we were founded by a group of off-Broadway theaters who came together and wanted to leverage their collective resources and relationships to find more of the resources and services that were needed for their sector to ensure stability and growth. From there, they went on to hire a staff, and the organization sort of grew professionally into the independent nonprofit that it is today. And as Kirk mentioned in his thoughtful description of us, we do have over 400 members. And our members are theaters that you probably know, like the Signature Theater and Manhattan Theater Club and Second Stage and Playwrights Horizons and New York Theater Workshop. And they're also theater companies that you may never encounter in your entire life. Theater companies that are being developed right now on Zooms throughout the city, comprised of recent BFA and MFA graduates, and theater companies that work really locally within their neighborhoods. And if you don't live in that neighborhood, you might not necessarily engage them, and that's okay, because they're there to serve that neighborhood, that group of blocks. I've got one about 15 minutes from where I live in Brooklyn Heights, down in Boerum Hill, called Smith Street Stage. They're amazing, and they provide great cultural services to the Boerum Hill community, and that's what they're there to do. And Art New York is here to serve all of those theaters, the smallest and the largest and everybody in between. And a lot of what we do is bring all of those theaters together to share resources and to share knowledge. Because one of the things that I think is so inspiring to me about the theater is that, again, it's people, and the people move fluidly throughout the sector. So the playwright who graduates from an MFA program and starts a small theater company might in a couple of years have a hit on Broadway. And then he might go back to that theater company that he started on Zoom and develop an experimental work with collaborators and then go back to Broadway. The people move fluidly throughout the sector. And so for that reason, the people always have, again, knowledge and resources to share with one another. And it's fostering and facilitating those convenings that's really at the heart of what Art New York does. And it's really what inspires us to keep going. We sort of delineate our services into four different buckets, if you will. One is space. We provide subsidized workspaces in the form of offices, rehearsal spaces, and 2 theaters. Our offices and rehearsal spaces are located across 2 buildings, one in Fort Greene in Brooklyn and one on 8th Avenue between 36th and 37th Street in Manhattan. And our theaters are located on the far west side of Manhattan on 10th Ave between 52nd and 53rd Street. All of these spaces provide the necessary tools for theater companies to run their administration and rehearse their shows and then present them to an audience. And we use them as well for many of our programs. And it's very important to us that we can provide these subsidized real estate offerings. As you can imagine, during the pandemic, just as all physical theaters were shut down, so were ours. Our office spaces were shut down very briefly. Fortunately, they could come back on fairly early in the pandemic. Our rehearsal spaces were shut down for a slightly longer period of time than the offices, and we've been really phasing their restart, starting with smaller groups who were only there to rehearse filmed performances that would be available digitally. And now we're able to have live in-person rehearsals for still smaller groups than we're used to. And we're seeing more and more rehearsal bookings all the time. I haven't lost a single office tenant except for 2 who were planning to sunset their theater companies this year. So I haven't lost any office tenants due to the pandemic. Part of that is because both as a landlord myself, I own the building in Fort Greene, and as sort of the master leaseholder in Manhattan, we've been able to negotiate both with ourselves and our own budget and with our landlord in Manhattan to provide some grace to our tenants. And we really the community in these spaces is really important. Like I was saying, that ability for our members to come together formally and informally and share experiences and collaborate on the development of projects and the growth of the sector drives so much of what we do. And so it was really important to us that we did everything we could to maintain the communities in our spaces. And we've been able to do that. We were able to offer almost a full break on rent for most of our tenants for the beginning of the pandemic. And we've slowly phased back in towards full rent, which we're not quite there yet. But it's with this kind of communal, very transparent approach that I'm proud we've been able to keep our tenants. And like I said, our rehearsal bookings are growing. And now that theaters can reopen, we've got bookings beginning in September and extending all the way into spring of 2022. This is inspiring for us, and I hope it's inspiring for all of you to know that theater artists are really ready to go back into spaces and start making work again. Our other services are connections. These are peer-to-peer learning opportunities. They take the form of roundtables. We govern the topics of these roundtables based on the stated needs of our members. And certainly during the pandemic, most of the roundtables have one way or another either been on accessing COVID relief funds and other resources, or producing digital works, or the New York State Workshare program, other issues around managing your staff in a pandemic. Now we've got roundtables on building your return to work plan. And these are really great opportunities for theaters to get together and discuss common challenges and also talk about, their individual responses to how they want to resolve those challenges. We also run very much more traditional expert-led training opportunities for those of you in the nonprofit sector already. For example, that the state requires that all nonprofit employees undergo anti-sexual harassment prevention training. Now, like I said, theater is people. It's a pretty intimate art form. Your standard anti-sexual harassment prevention training isn't going to be as relevant to a group of theater makers who, again, have to speak about and use the body as part of their work. So Art New York worked with some government colleagues. This is before my time, so don't ask me too many questions about how this training was developed. No. Art New York worked with government colleagues and others to develop a theater-specific anti-sexual harassment prevention training that comports with state requirements. So now you can send all of your workers to us to get this done. We offer it throughout the year. You can also book us privately to train your whole staff. This is actually, more than it being important because it's responsive to the needs of theater workers, which are quite specific. It's also really important because, as you can imagine, theaters hire a lot of contract workers, and even contract workers have to go through this training. And so the fact that we can make it available makes your onboarding process for your workers a lot easier. This is the kind of really wonky stuff that an artist services organization provides that doesn't necessarily show up on stage, but helps keep theaters running and thriving. And then the fourth kind of bucket for our services is funding. We are a re-grantor for the New York State Council on the Arts, as well as the Mellon Foundation and a number of small family foundations. We also develop our own funds. Currently, the fund that we have developed during the pandemic has given out, I think, close to $350,000. It's a COVID relief fund for small theaters. For us, small theaters means theaters with a budget size of $250,000 or less. This is a very typical floor for grant makers. What do I mean by that? Private foundations typically won't fund theaters with a budget size under 250K. So we come in there with this COVID relief fund and a couple of other specific funding programs to help seed the ground. Like I said before, talent moves fluidly throughout the sector and can have as critical a moment with a small budget size theater as they can on Broadway. And a lot of talent, as you can imagine, and as I sort of gave in my example, begins in a small theater. So seeding the ground, really making sure that small companies can grow and thrive and self-determine when they want to go past that 250K mark is super important to what we do, again, to help stabilize and grow the whole sector. So that is why we offer a number of specific funding opportunities to those smaller theaters. So that's a little bit about Art New York, and I hope it maybe illuminates for you why I'm here to talk about, off Broadway theaters today. Again, I don't know much about you folks in the audience, and so one thing I thought I might share is just for reference. So off Broadway and kind of, under that delineation means that your theater has 499 seats or less. And then Broadway theaters are 500 seats and above. So that might give you some sense of the size of the theaters that we're talking about. They're pretty, they can be quite significant and quite intimate. Another fun fact that I wanted to share, and then I'm going to get into sort of the impact of the pandemic on off-Broadway theater, as well as the current state of things, is that in 2019, theaters outside of Broadway, so you can sort of understand that to be off-Broadway theater, provided $584 million in direct economic impact and $1.3 billion in indirect economic impact to New York City. And that's in 1 year. Is this, on some level, a far cry from the collective impact of Broadway? Yes. But when you consider the wholeness of the sector, and the fact that off-Broadway typically serves an audience comprised of residents from the region, so New York City, Westchester, nearby New Jersey counties, Long Island, it's pretty tremendous. And then that was pretty much wiped out by the pandemic. Now, I don't like to say that theater stopped. Um, Physical theaters did close, and rightfully so, out of a concern for health and safety during the pandemic. But theater makers didn't stop making theater. As you see from my anecdotes about not losing tenants, theater companies didn't fold. They've fallen on tremendously hard times. I don't want to overlook that, but they've done what they can to keep their theaters up and running. They're offering virtual programming. They're planning for the future, and they're focusing on some internal operational shifts that I'll talk about a little bit too. So theater didn't stop, but theaters did have to close. I was thinking about, how do I want to characterize the impact of the pandemic on off-Broadway theater? And as much as I am working to navigate this and respond to it in my role at Art New York, it's not something that I actually have had the time to put pen to paper about. So this is like a really great opportunity for me. And I broke it down for myself kind of under 3 summary points. The first thing that came to mind for me in terms of the impact of the pandemic on theater is just the sudden loss of culture. And I was alluding to this before. Theater is people. We work intimately with one another. We build live performances. We're different from film and television and other recorded performances in that we are live. That's what makes theater special. You go to the theater and you make a collective decision with your fellow audiences to decide that what is happening on stage in front of you, even though you know full well it is a fiction and it's people playing pretend, you decide together that it's real. And we facilitate your decision by being talented and building beautiful things and writing compelling texts. But we all make this decision together that for the 90 or 120 minutes that we're watching the show, something we know isn't real is actually real. It's like being a kid and believing in Santa Claus. It's really powerful. And we lost that when theaters had to close. And we had to rebuild it because that is the thing that keeps us going. And that was really, really hard because we had to rebuild that while we were also figuring out how to shut down and how to keep ourselves safe, like beyond the work of theater. How do we just keep ourselves safe as individuals, as people who have families, as friends, as neighbors? It was really, really difficult to immediately lose sort of the dominant piece of our culture. But we figured it out to the best that we could, and we've stayed in it, and now we're really excited to come back, although I think that's going to be a slow build back. Again, I think another major point about the impact that I want to make is that not only did we need to change, but we needed to approach the unknown. None of us have lived through a global pandemic in our lifetimes. And so none of us knew how to deal with any of that. Like I was saying before, how to stay safe and sane, and like what would we need in order to do that for however long we were going to be in confinement. But also, how do you keep a theater company running when you lose your box office is a major question. What are the conversations that you need to have with your funders when you're all, again, grappling with the same challenges of living in a pandemic, but you've got to make sure that your philanthropic dollars are staying current because you've just lost that box office. So we've had to approach the unknown with no frame of reference for it. And then I'm reading from notes, can you tell? Simultaneously, this is my third point about impact. So simultaneously with the pandemic, we were working during a time with a national and a field-wide demand for racial justice and accountability. And certainly our country's grappling with the impacts of racism and racial violence extend well before 2020. And we will continue to grapple with this, I believe, also for our lifetimes. But this coincided with the pandemic. And we saw things like a group of Black and brown theater makers come together and deliver a document called We See You, White American Theater, which compelled a lot of theaters to respond to specific demands about how their theaters operate in an anti-racist framework or not. And so all of a sudden we were doing that and responding to a pandemic. To me, this is very hopeful. It reminds us of our elasticity. It reminds us of our ability to deal with compound challenges and our strength and resilience in that. And it reminds us that our most important assets are one another. And if we can't figure out how to operate differently and treat each other better, that's going to be the death knell for theater more than any pandemic ever will. So I've been really proud to work in theater at this time where we're trying to develop anti-racist practices in our individual theaters and throughout the field. But that is a compounded challenge together with the pandemic. And it's been, again, very difficult to deal with the emotions that rise up out of that work while we're also dealing with the uncertainty and the threats of the pandemic itself. So building from that, here's kind of how I see the current status of off-Broadway, looking to, the relaxation of capacity requirements tomorrow. And this is where we're going to really wade into the unknown. And I might be a very unsatisfying speaker when we get to Q&A, because some of my answers might be, I don't know, what do you think? But again, here's how I kind of want to break down the current state of things. Like I was just talking about, we're undergoing major operational shifts in our processes and protocols to become more compassionate, more inclusive, more equitable institutions. And like I said, this is the crucial work. Like the work to withstand and stabilize through the pandemic is, of course, critically important. But if we cannot develop more inclusive, more compassionate, more just institutions, we will not survive. And to my way of thinking, we shouldn't, because we have to treat each other better. Service organizations like mine have come up with some programming to bring in specialized consultants to work with theaters on this. My organization itself offers micro grants to help you pay for additional services around this. And our peer learning programs help you look and see what other theaters are doing that you might want to copy, because in a lot of this, there's not a need to reinvent the wheel. And some amazing people have been advocating and agitating for racial justice for a very long time and have some great ideas about how to achieve that in our theaters. And maybe we should just replicate what they've been advocating for. And our peer learning opportunities give you the chance to see what that is and decide how to implement it in your theater. We're also dealing with a moment of major generational turnover. Again, that was going to happen whether there was a pandemic or not. The pandemic has spurred some of these leadership transitions because people are rightfully, exhausted. But again, we're seeing a lot of internal shifts. I don't know how that's going to show up on stage. I like to think it will continue to diversify the storytellers and allow people to tell their own stories on stage, which hopefully will mean more inclusive programming throughout the city. But we don't know yet. And, let's be excited for what is to come there. We're flipping back to the pandemic for a moment. We're planning to be in person while still largely virtual. There's a lot of challenges around that. I think we're just now getting to the point, at least in my organization, where the majority of our staff is vaccinated. People are still, anxious about coming in, about commuting, about leaving their homes or their neighborhoods. We have to work through all of that, which means staying remote for a little while, even though we could actually go into the office. My organization, I think, is no different from other theaters in this respect. So again, we're planning to be in person while remaining virtual, and there are some challenges there. And we're also trying to figure out what are the restrictions that we need to comply with as they continue to change. I'm certainly not frustrated that science provides us with new data all the time, to which we need to be responsive. But it is difficult to, deal with a ground that is constantly shifting beneath your feet when you're trying to make some static protocols and processes for your organization. it's emotionally exhausting, I would say. And I don't think that's specific to theater either. I think most sectors are dealing with a labor force that, there was that Times article a few weeks ago that talked about languishing. We're very tired, but all of a sudden this isn't our opportunity to reopen. And we have to figure that out. But again, we have to, I think, own sort of the emotional place that we're all in addition to, like I said, the challenge of dealing with this while we're still working virtually. And then there's still a lot of uncertainty around kind of how to prepare our spaces. And a lot of this has to do with shifting union guidelines that often feel far more restrictive than what the state is offering. But we are beholden to those union guidelines because theater companies need to get those union contracts in order to do their shows with the talent that they want to work with. So it's very challenging to know, like, what are the retrofits and renovations that we're going to have to make in our theaters. And again, that's a big budget task when you've lost the majority of your earned income. And yes, of course, the federal government has provided us with the opportunity to apply for these shuttered venue operators grants. But those grants were announced at the end of calendar year 2020. I'm not mad at the grants. I'm really happy about them. I've applied for one myself. It will be the transformational funding if we are to get it. But they were announced at the end of 2020. We couldn't apply till mid-April. So that's 4.5 months between announcement and application. And nobody knows the results yet. And so we continue to live in a state of financial uncertainty, knowing that we need to make probably need to make some repairs to our theaters. And we're also, kind of at the mercy of some contractors in order to do that. One of the things that the Actors Equity Union is requiring is a certain number of returns of air throughout your theater. You need to do a specific kind of test to see how many full returns. I got a quote from a contractor today. I mean, this quote was shared with me from my facility staff, who are much smarter than me about this. It's like $14,000 just to do the test. We probably have to do it. We're going to try to find somebody who will do it for less money. We're not the only theater that's looking at a bill like this and going like, I don't really have 14 grand right now. But it's extremely stressful to again, deal with kind of the uncertainty around what do I need to do to make my spaces, my theater useful? And how am I going to come up with the money to do that? I'm just reading from my notes and realizing that one of the things that suffered for me in the pandemic is my handwriting. Yeah, we're not sure who's going to be in the audience in the future. So theaters shut down for 3 days after the September 11th attacks. As we've been discussing, theaters have been closed for 15 months. There was a massive coordinated marketing effort facilitated by the city of New York to encourage people back into theaters after the 3-day closure following the September 11th attacks, and remind them that the theater is a safe place to be. The theater is a necessary place to be. It's part of the vibrancy of New York City. As Kirk was saying in the beginning, it's part of why you live here. It's a place to come together with different kinds of people and both, experience something unique and special, but also reflect on your life and your challenges and figure out how you want to move forward together. We've been closed again for 15 months. There's no coordinated marketing effort from the city yet. I think I heard that New York City and Company was given $30 million. Again, I don't know how that's going to be used to get people back to the theater. No individual theater alone can, I think, implement the marketing plan needed to ensure that we're going to get audiences back to 2019 levels. This is a big concern of mine, and it's certainly my largest point of frustration with the city. It's like, where's the marketing campaign? We know how to make theater. We can still do that. We'll figure it out with the unions. We're figuring out our spaces. We've developed funds. We'll figure out how to pay for things. Not that I'm not, looking for money and additional resources from the government. But we need your help with marketing. You need to tell people that it is safe and okay to go to the theater if they wish to do that. We're all very concerned about who is going to be in the audience. And I'm not the best person to tell you who's going to be in the audience because I'm a really specific type of theater goer. I see a lot of theater because it's professionally required of me. So I'm curious to hear from you folks about if you feel ready to go to the theater or not. And honestly, like, no shame if you aren't, because I think, I've certainly had that moment where, am I okay not wearing my mask when I'm outside walking around or going for a jog? Yes. Am I still wearing it when I walk into my apartment building or go into a store? Absolutely. So I'm still dealing with a level of anxiety, some of which is well-founded and some of which is just the effect of living in confinement for 15, 16 months. And like I said, you have to deal with that emotional place that people are all in. That's the end of my prepared remarks. And I've been monologuing, to use a theater term, at you for at least 25 minutes now. So I'm eager to hear someone else's voice and answer some questions if I can.
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, we're going to skip the you and me interview part. I have had the luxury of talking to you. You've been very gracious with your time on a couple of occasions. And so I've learned a lot from you already, although I've got a million other questions. So we'll just have to Zoom at another time, I think, because there's a lot of questions that have already been posted. And I think with the time remaining, it may be all that we can get to. However, I'm going to ask the group, the attendees, that when you post questions going forward, that you include whether you plan on going back to the theater now or as soon as they're open, and what concerns you might have, or why you don't have concerns. Perhaps, that's not mandatory for your questions, but it might help Risa a lot as far as getting a gauge of things. And I'm sure she would like to hear those things.
Yeah.
So Rini, if you wouldn't mind, why don't you start with the questions? You're on mute.
Hi, Risa. Can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Okay. So the last question that came in made me laugh out loud. So okay. I'm going to start with that one. But it's a serious question.
Yeah.
Will the current lumber shortages impact your ability for sets?
So I'm not a designer, and this is why I spent a little time talking about what a service organization does. So I can reasonably tell you, I'm not a designer and I'm not a producer, so I'm not as up on this. However, I've had a lot of friends, as probably many of you had, that have been trying to deal with home and office renovations. And yes, these constraints in our supply chains have slowed down production schedules in those other sectors. So I can't answer this question specifically, but I would imagine it is a concern for people. Now, fortunately, we, a lot of theaters are not going to open until the fall. So we have a little bit of time to deal with longer shipping times. And we can also use reclaimed materials a lot of the time in theater. But yeah, I would imagine that is a concern.
We, I mean, we're in the unenviable spot of ordering appliances, and it's been a disaster.
Yep.
There was another question then around, did Equity change health insurance policies for people that were unable to act or work during this period?
They did, and I forget exactly what was decided, but they had to, because you can't really be a union and have your sector both out of work and uninsured during a pandemic. So they did do that. Again, another interesting thing about our organization is, though we do have theaters that we operate, the producers of the shows negotiate the contracts. We don't. We're the landlord, basically. So there's some specifics around union rules that I'm less aware of because I don't have to negotiate those. The building requirements are the things that I know a little bit more about, because those do impact people's ability to rent from us.
So one of the questions that might fall under that scope is around, and you did address it a little bit, but around vaccine passports.
Yeah.
You know, there's those of us that have already got the Excelsior Pass on our
Sure.
phone, and there's those of us that really don't want that big brother.
Yep. I, like a lot of us, I have a couple of regular Zoom meetings with colleagues. This is a big topic. I would say that my colleagues are of the exact mixed opinion, Rini, that you just stated. Some folks are really focused on testing audience members. I know that that's going to be Park Avenue Armory's stance, and I know, Kirk, you'd wanted to ask about that, so maybe I can reflect on it here. So Park Avenue Armory has stated that they're going to test everybody who comes in the door, and that test is built into the ticket price. I've had some calls with the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment and New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation. I think if we can achieve a degree of critical mass, we could have testing hubs set up if that's what's going to be the thing that's going to make audiences feel comfortable. So there's a lot of folks focused on testing. And then there are folks who are saying, if everybody's vaccinated, then aren't we just that much more safe? Aren't we that much more safe? That's, more of a guarantee. Shouldn't we just focus on that? But then there's the big brother question, the question of like, do I really want to be policing people? Also, for a Broadway theater to bring in the front of house staff to check the Excelsior Pass is not a heavy lift. For a small theater that has, suffered under the constraint of income, that's maybe more house staff than they can afford. I know that might sound shocking to people, but the difference between one person at the door and 3 or 5 is a big difference, again, when your margins are really, really narrow. So I think, I'm glad people are asking, because I think it's a really important question. I think we're going to probably go the testing route to avoid that big brother implication, which I think is important. But I also, I am vaccinated and I have the Excelsior Pass because I want to move through the world with a level of ease. But I don't shame anybody who feels differently. I really don't.
I am going to, sorry, I said I was going to stay away, but all right, I do like this topic.
Yeah.
I was reading, I think it's for sporting events, that there's actually going to be non-vaccinated sections where people will go. Is that a possibility? You laugh, so I guess that's not a possibility.
That's not going to work for us.
Okay,
I can't do that.
It'd be like a public shaming app.
Yeah, that really freaks me out. There are, like I said, I'm vaccinated. I'm very comfortable with that. My wife and I have spoken, and we have like I said, I didn't say this to the audience, but we have a small child. When we can vaccinate our child, we will do that. We're very comfortable with this as a family. But I am not comfortable like shaming people. And also there are folks, maybe they're a small percentage of the population, but there are some people who, because of the use of immunosuppressing drugs for transplants and other conditions that suppress your immunity, they can't get the vaccine. And they shouldn't be shamed in that way. And I'm not saying they're saying they should, Kirk, but no, I won't do that. And I would come down pretty hard on that.
I've taken particular delight in shaming people this pandemic, so I'm not the right person to ask this question. Okay. All right, I'm back to the shadows. Sorry. Yeah,
it's okay. I mean, I'll just say one other thing. This has come up in a really interesting way for my staff. We have an ad hoc return to work plan in place right now. We're developing a hybrid plan to bring everybody back in some fashion starting in the fall. Because people have of their own accord disclosed their status, we are pretty comfortable working under the knowledge that our staff is vaccinated. We're also hiring people. Those folks are probably not going to disclose because they've already been vaccinated. Like, people were disclosing because they were like, I'm getting it. And they were excited. And they had to take time off and stuff like that. So we are not building a hybrid work plan that takes into account the current status of vaccinations across our staff, because we're not going to ask. and we're going to assume that for some reason somebody might not be vaccinated. So we're looking at some degree of social distancing and some masking requirements.
No, difficult.
Yeah.
So then there's a group of questions around how did the theater community survive this, past 15 months? You did say that there was some grant money, but people have mortgages and food,
Yes.
they need to buy, kids. The federal bailout money maybe help the theaters, not sure that trickle down to the people that are in the theaters, necessarily the actors or people that are not associated with a company that look for gig work and stuff. How did that community hold up through this? And
a lot of people had to leave, had to go stay with family. A lot of people lost work and were able to go on unemployment. So some folks weren't, depending on their status. I think we won't know how detrimental it has been for some time. Because if you've been able to continue working, we see you. And so there's a little bit of confirmation bias in there, and it's hard to know exactly the folks that have exited the workforce in the sector, but we have to assume it was a significant amount. We are able to bring people back now. PPP round 1 and 2 did help a lot of organizations, mine included. My organization also worked with a community bank to make that process swifter for our members, and set them up with some technical assistance. So I think a lot of us banded together to do everything we could to access relief funding and ensure that as many people as possible could keep their jobs, but a lot didn't. And again, they've exited the workforce, they've moved to other places. So there's talent that we've lost that we will be able to count and reflect on. And then there's also a lot of talent that we've lost that we'll never know about. And that's, again, emotionally difficult. I do think that the sector will continue to grow, but it's sad. It's very sad to think about those folks who lost their jobs.
So one step back on the last conversation where we talked about the Excelsior Pass and testing. Could it also be a hybrid of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of us who are gonna, again, when we'll test, we'll accept the Excelsior Pass, and then maybe you won't need to get the test. Like we're looking at nonprofit and off-Broadway seems to look at a lot of models.
Entering the theater, coming in broadies.
Right.
Same approach.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody saw an article from a couple of days ago in the Times, but a few big Broadway producers got together and announced that they're requiring vaccination for the folks backstage, so inclusive of talent, but not for the audience. And I think that's a bit of a bellwether and a guide for people.
So in terms of Broadway and off-Broadway, and probably in different areas, 1 around COVID, 2 around returning audiences, 3 around marketing, is Broadway, what's the difference in impact between, or is there any, between off-Broadway and Broadway? Did off-Broadway suffer more, or will it be harder to bring off-Broadway back?
I don't want to say, I don't like to think about who suffered more, right? It's like nobody likes the oppression Olympics. But I do think about it in some a little more concrete ways. On one hand, I think a lot of us have heard about the relationship between the economics of running your theater and capacity, right? And for Broadway theaters, it's not really feasible to come back until you can be at 100% capacity, because anything less than that, isn't going to afford you the expenses and the return on investment you need to keep the show running for a significant period of time. Off-Broadway theater, nonprofit theaters, can reopen at less than 100% capacity because we're subsidized. So there's a different economic concern in that regard. At the same time, we have a different access to capital than Broadway does. So there's, kind of a constraint there that Broadway doesn't experience. The other things that I think about here, I think have to do with like the sheer cost of running our theaters and the cost of recapitalization. We're very much still learning about that. So I think all theaters have suffered greatly due to the necessary closure of our venues. And Art New York at least has done everything that we can to provide for the resources to stabilize off-Broadway and nonprofit theater.
Right, then there's a whole group of questions around Zoom and hybrid models going forward. And, you know, how does that play a role? I know that you talked about earlier, you talked about, you know, how a lot of stuff was incubating in Zoom.
Yep.
And was that a new experience for these theaters? And do they intend
Absolutely.
on bringing it forward? And how does this new Zoom world play into?
Yeah, I mean, this is starting to give you like my Risa Shoup editorial, which might be a little different from somebody else's. I think the importance of Zoom was that it allowed people to continue to make theater and hone their craft and tell stories and maintain a certain level of audience and certainly keep their institutions running. And I've seen some amazing work, you know, virtually, and that was really not only entertaining, but it was really uplifting for me to see, you know, this kind of theatrical magic at home on my TV or on my computer screen. But like I said in the very beginning, it's the liveness of theater that is so special. That cannot be replicated, full stop. So I don't think that a hybrid model or virtual theater is going to become dominant in any way, because that's just not, you know, that's not what we do on some level. I do think that some of these theatrical streaming services that lower barriers to access for people to go to see theater are going to stay. And I think that's tremendous. And I think, you know, how we monetize that will probably shift over time. But I love the idea that folks, you know, either because of geography or health or time constraints, who couldn't get to the theater before can see it. Like, that's amazing. I would have loved that growing up. So I think this is, you know, I think there are a lot of advantages here, but it's not going to supplant theater, you know, what it is to make theater. Again, it's the liveness that is so very special and sets us apart from, you know, all other, you know, forms of recorded performance.
So then I think the last question I think that I've got is around marketing. So you indicated prior that, I'm just checking to see if there's any more questions. The city does the marketing.
Well, I mean, theaters do their own marketing for their seasons, but we need like we need something that inclusive of and beyond marketing shows tells people theaters are reopen. It's a thing you can do. You can do it safely. Here's how we're making it safe for you. Here's what you can expect when you go to theaters. Here's where you can buy tickets. Like, we need to reinvigorate people's understanding of going to the theater, because we've all been, you know, very reasonably and rightly so distracted for the last 15, 16 months. And we need to be reminded of why we love going to the theater and that it is a safe thing to do and that this is how we're going to do it.
So, and then I'll do a little editorializing on my, Kirk and I live in Midtown. We have a 24-year-old son. His age group, they're back.
Yep.
You know, they're you know, ready to go into the bars and the clubs, and you know, you walk up Third Avenue and the avenues are packed, and but the theater crowd tends to be a little older.
Right. That's right.
And you have people in my age group that say, but the seats are so tight.
Yep.
It's so congested there. That's a little scary. So I guess that can be addressed by, you know, just people getting out and walking around. And I think, you know, those of us in New York have been traumatized by what happened in our city.
Of course.
It was different than any other part of the States.
Yeah.
But what's your opinion? So, I mean, we can, the city can do their marketing, and I think people getting out, taking walks and realizing that it's okay to take their masks off and then feeling comfortable getting in the elevator without their mask on, or, will all come. And I think probably you're right, around the fall. We need to get people out and feeling comfortable before they're ready to go back inside.
Yep.
But do you have a different version of how you think it might play out? Or?
It's not that I have a different version. I don't have a different version. I think the one thing I would add is people know what is right for them. So what you have to do is give them the information about the environment that they're going into. And this is what I tell our members, and what, our theaters will provide, which is tell them, how are you helping to make them safe to the degree that you are? What can they expect when they go there? Are they going to be tested? What are your vaccine requirements if you have any? How far apart are the seats going to be? What's the bathroom situation going to be like? Tell them everything that they can expect, and they will make their own good decisions for themselves. And also then, they will be able to comply with your rules so that you can uphold, again, those standards of safety. So we have to do our part as well, but we need the city's help to tell folks theaters are reopened. We need you to buy tickets. Theater is important. You love the theater, come back to it. It's safe, etc.
So I want to, so there's one more final question, and I'm going to read this one because I thought you answered it, but maybe there was something in the question that I missed. Someone recently described the one-click approach to daily life popularized by Amazon, which has only strengthened during this time of COVID. Do you fear that theater audiences might be less willing to re-engage with the physical world post-pandemic, especially if they can now easily stream theater works, both old and new? And he's commenting that he personally feels, he hopes that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And it's laziness and can be a powerful motivator.
I agree that it can. I also think we're sick and tired of sitting on the couch and watching things on the screen, and we want to be together. You see that when you walk around your neighborhood and you see folks even doing outdoor dining. Like, we crave human connection. We're really lonely. We really miss one another. So I think that will drive people to want to see live performance again, to see theater again. I think it also, it's up to, theaters have to do their part to tell you what to expect and to build really exciting seasons, which I'm absolutely seeing. There's tons of season announcements happening right now, and there's a lot of great work coming to the stage. So I think we are definitely offering a compelling product. And I think some of it also has to do with the accessibility of tickets, by which I mean the price, but also how do we get them? How easy can we make it for you to get a ticket and go to the theater? How well can we connect that to other neighborhood offerings, to transit? I think all of these things are important in light of maybe not defeating laziness, but making it easy for people to do this.
Okay, thank you. Kirk?
Great. Risa, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap up in just a few minutes. So if you have any other questions out there, I would get them in immediately. I am extremely bullish on Off-Broadway, and I think it's formulated because of you. First of all, as you had said, the theaters, while they are require funding, are not necessarily have to have 90% of the seats filled to work. That's the concern about whether a show is even going to be profitable on Broadway. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think that we're going to see, and we discussed this in the tourism segment a few weeks back, that internationally and even far distance around the country is going to be a lag as far as coming back to the city. We're not going to have the business travelers, and we're not going to have the 4 or 5 day stays in New York, the theater weeks that people did. I think that the New Yorkers, and as Rini was saying, the young people, the people in the tri-state area, the ones who have probably been the backbone of off-Broadway theater, are the ones who are going to come back first. Yep. And I really, you mentioned the word bellwether. I think off-Broadway will be the bellwether for theater in New York. Do all those things add up?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we certainly think so, both because we view off-Broadway kind of as like the beating heart of the sector, because it's where so much talent begins and then returns to grow and change and then go back out to film, to TV, to Broadway. So I agree that we are some kind of marker about the health of theater in the city and in the country overall. And I definitely agree that, as I said, our audiences are regional audiences. And because there still are so many so many restrictions on travel, other challenges to traveling, we're going to be, we fellow New Yorkers, we're going to be the first audience members. Yeah. And that's a real, I hope for people, that's a place of honor, and it's a real privilege.
Yeah. One thing you said that makes me sad, which I hope isn't true, and I may be misinterpreting what you were saying, the talent that we'll never know about.
Yeah.
I wonder about the people who may be at a point in their life where they're beginning to think about a career, or maybe they were in high schools that were shut down and weren't able to do plays and things like that. And I hope that's not true. I hope that there are incredible talents that are going to see through all this and continue to fight their way onto a New York stage.
We do too. One of our colleague organizations is the Arts and Education Roundtable, which is a service organization like ours that works with teaching artists and educational institutions. And they've been doing great work to ensure that kids in remote learning environments are still getting arts education, getting to make art together. Oh. So I am hopeful, but you just have to imagine that people have had a change of mind, a change of heart, a change of circumstance there.
Yes, absolutely. Risa, I can't thank you enough. You were just a great encouragement. I can hardly wait to get back to an off-Broadway theater soon.
Love that.
So thank you again for your time. It was greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much, Kirk. Thank you all for coming and sort of listening to me yammer on, and for your very thoughtful questions. This has been really fun.
Thanks, Risa.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Thanks again to Risa and Rini. And next week marks our last evening of the COVID-19 and the Future of New York conference. It will be with James Spencer. He is an architect and author, but perhaps most famously the collaborator with Rick Burns on the New York PBS documentary, New York. So we would love to have you back for that. It will be a culmination of everything that we've discussed over the last 8 weeks. And we look forward to seeing you then. The city will survive, but it will never be the same. Have a great night, everyone. See you next week.